Thank you, everybody, for coming today to the CMS Book Club. I'm Roxane Gardner. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Medical Simulation, and we'll help facilitate this wonderful conversation we're about to embark upon. The book that we're featuring today is Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as if your life depended on it. And it's written by Chris Voss, who was a former international FBI hostage negotiator. So he has a wealth of experience. I'm wondering what about the book, or what about negotiation and having a negotiation type of conversation captivates you or captivated you most?
Yeah, thank you, Rox. Grace Ng here, Senior Director overseeing faculty development programs at the Center for Medical Simulation. I think the thing that really stood out about this book is how practical everything is. And I can tell you with 100% certainty that I will never be an FBI hostage negotiator. I can tell you that for sure. However, as someone who is passionate about helping others improve the debriefing skills and difficult conversation skills, this book is fully packed with so many practical things that has close parallels to what we do and what we teach at CMS. So one thing that stood out right off the bat is, the author's use of calibrated questions. And at CMS, and for people who've taken our courses, know that we propose this method of using advocacy inquiry as a way to open up conversations in debriefing. And the calibrated questions is just so closely parallel to what we teach. And I really love how they labeled it. And it's really about asking questions that lead with what, how, instead of asking why. And instead of asking yes, no type questions. I really like how they specifically call those as calibrated questions, and that's even a sharper term than what we use as just inquiry. So I'm learning a whole lot from reading this book.
I'll jump in. Leah Cruz here, pediatric emergency medicine from Charlotte, North Carolina. So one of the things that was very striking to me about this book is that it did allow me to reflect on the many life experiences that I had not previously labeled as a negotiation. Ones that may not have been a tense conversation even, perhaps it was a collegial conversation, but reframing this as, yes, there is a negotiation going on, has allowed me to rethink how I might approach that in the future. And I also, in a way, feel like it's now primed me to look for those moving forward when I pick up the phone, when I speak with a consultant. For me, that's been empowering.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Leah, because I had taken, as part of my school public health master's program many years ago, won't tell you when, we had to take a conflict negotiation class, and it was a really interesting class. The materials, though, that we use, I thought they were good at the time, but I really wish I'd had this book, because I think it really maps out a lot more about things to think about as you're constructing the conversation or preparing for the conversation, and then as you're having the conversation and winding down, that I think would have been more useful for us at that time. And one of the other take-home messages of the book was really when he started getting into financial negotiations and salary negotiations. And I know I could have benefited from those pointers as I went through my own experiences along the way, the pathway of life in achieving a particular salary and having to negotiate what that was with key members who were leaders of my department, et cetera.
Well, I learned to practice deep listening skills. And so that particular aspect of it resonates with me. And years ago, I took a course by the Presencing Institute for a few days that was about, it wasn't about negotiation. It was about creativity, and particularly for socially conscious nonprofits, of how do you get creative. And it really is ultimately, if you use deep listening skills, that's where you get some, what do you call it, black swan ideas. They didn't call it that, but that kind of resonates with me of the use of listening, but it means shutting off your mind, and you really have to listen to the other person's words, and you have to be metacognitive that what your brain is doing while somebody else is talking is thinking about what your response is going to be to them and what you're going to say to them, and even sometimes trying to solve the problem. But deep listening is you don't do any of that. You just really listen. And that's where I get to use the black swan term. That's how black swans are most likely to emerge. So, but I'm curious about how other people have seen the lessons in this book and how they apply, not just to direct negotiations. How broadly do you apply it? Because I can't think right now of negotiations. I'm just not in the position to negotiate things. It doesn't come up because I'm mostly retired, but I have lots of activities. But mostly they're discussions or not even debates. They're kind of processing something.
Mhm.
So how do the principles that you read in this book apply more broadly to your conversations? It's not just that you're trying to get to a answer to something.
I think that it's a lot more readily available for me to say, this might come up with a conversation with a consultant or maybe a decision regarding management. But in thinking about what you said about broader applications, I also think this can be highly applicable when we're talking with our learners who are in my field, residents in pediatric emergency medicine, because to get them to the point where they can turn off their brain and think is a much different task for them. They are holding all of that knowledge right in the forefront of their brain, which is complex clinical content. And I can see that they have such a desire to hang on to that content. I think it's that much harder for them to let it go into the listening phase. And I also think that I see it when we negotiate with our learners, that there is a learning point to be made. And that's one that I think we see commonly.
That's such a great point. I totally agree. And I think broadening it a little bit too. I think anytime that we would want someone to think about something differently or change their behavior, I think this book really helped me look at it from the lens of it's a negotiation. Because I want one thing as a debriefer, I want the learner to maybe go from step A to step B. And I think this book helped me understand that it's not just a knowledge issue. I think it helped me just, I guess, reconfirm that. But scanning for patterns across the different chapters, I think the authors are saying that negotiations is a very emotionally driven process. And I'm thinking for many people who work with us in our courses, run into trouble with the debriefings because emotions is a blind spot for them. Many people think, oh, it's debriefing, it's about knowledge transfer. It's not. It's about navigating through the difficult emotions of giving something up, changing your behavior, recognizing that, if I want something, I need to let go of something else. And that's an emotional process. All the chapters are talking about, being aware of your own emotions, being aware of the emotions of your negotiation partner as well, and how that drives their desires and behaviors as well. So I think that's kind of a big take-home point for me as well.
You were talking about a negotiation with a consultant. I wonder if you can, it doesn't have to be a real one, but something that if it was a real one, that's fine. And think about that, the negotiation aspect. And maybe you can talk about some of the specifics of how this book got you to think about the way you would handle that conversation. That's a negotiation, really specifically around that it's your patient and you're calling this consultant. Could you be kind of specific and take us through how it might work and what lessons from the book you might apply more specifically as you're doing it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'd be happy
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No problem.
But I think it would be fun for you to think through, because then it would be kind of practical in a clinical sense of how you might use it.
It's highly applicable. My field is emergency medicine, and so we often interact with many different consultants. We are sort of like the melting pot of the hospital, right? We interact with surgical fields, with medicine fields, et cetera. So one of the most common negotiations we have is winter season here in the States. And so we have lots of respiratory illnesses and viruses, which means there are lots of admissions. Therefore, the hospitals become full. It becomes harder and harder to say, do we want to go ahead and make this patient meet admission criteria? From my standpoint, we don't necessarily want to change that threshold. We're seeing these kids when they come in, but from the hospital standpoint, they have to weigh so many other factors. They have to weigh bed capacity, et cetera. And so a conversation that I commonly have these days is we have a patient who we call as a gray area, not a slam dunk. It's going to be an easy admission phone call, but perhaps we're in the emergency room a little bit hesitant to say discharge the patient, easily can go home. And so the point of negotiation is always around, I have a child who needs to be admitted. These are the reasons why I think they need to come in. And yet we're getting sometimes more than others, hesitation because there are lots of other factors at play. And so what this book makes me think about are, well, number one, am I listening and really hearing from their perspective, their point of view? Perhaps where I am ready to come back with a response, I need to listen further. I need to really become completely neutral and hear, because it's possible one of the answers is in what they're saying. And I'm not going to know that if I'm not listening through. One of the other tactics that I really like is, once we've gathered and listened to the consultant, how is it that I can reframe this in a way, in the mirroring technique that Chris Voss talks about, where I can then mirror back and get them to say, yeah, that's exactly right. I find that particularly to be very diffusing for these conversations in a way that it sometimes can help move our conversation forward and past the sticking point.
Could you be more specific about the mirroring?
Sure.
Give a specific example of how you do that, how it would apply?
Sure. So if I say, hi, I have a child who's been intermittently hypoxic, so occasionally is having a drop in their oxygen saturation, but it's not so persistent that we've put them on tons of oxygen support, but I'm uncomfortable enough that, I want to call, see if we can observe the patient. And they may provide me with, I really don't think the patient needs to be hospitalized if they're not wearing oxygen 100% of the time. So where in prior state, I might come back with another answer that I have, but to mirror the way that Chris Voss describes would be to say, okay, so what I'm hearing you say is you're thinking this patient might not need to be admitted because they are not wearing oxygen right now. And I need to really consider from their point of view why that's the case, to the point where they actually believe me, that I've listened to them and I've heard in a way that I'm understanding their perspective.
That's great. Thanks.
I'm fully aligned, let me say. I learned a lot reading this book, and also following people like Chris Voss in England a few years ago, negotiators from Scotland Yard. I learned, first of all, that you do not have to reject, but to reframe. So what Leah was saying, because you have to try to understand point of views, epistemologies, way of thinking about the world of the people you are talking to or negotiating with. I was not aware about that before Chris Voss. And a second thing I learned is trying to count, really using numbers to understand how many words I'm used to say and how many words I'm listening from other people. And it's easy, but I was not able to do that before.
Yeah, Fernando, thanks so much for sharing Fernando Salvetti is our colleague from Italy, from Turin, and we have worked together with CMS and Fernando's team on a number of projects since about 2015. And I was especially happy you joined, Fernando, not only because I wanted your impressions about the book and your input and experiences, also with respect to some of the training that you've been doing in training people to have negotiating type of conversations, and the simulations that you create in the business arena for that to happen.
For us, is Chris Voss many times is the pillar of our negotiation programs. Sometimes are other guys following other path. Nevertheless, Chris Voss, in my opinion, because he's a huge experience with FBI, is really interesting because, let's say, he's across industry. Could be applied within healthcare as well as within oil and gas or automotive or banking. In my case, as a formerly public prosecutor and criminal lawyer, also within the legal field. For example, I had the chance to co-design a program about negotiating with pirates. Pirates are a huge issue because usually they put at risk many lives. And the lives at risk are also their own lives, because usually if pirates are not able to go home, to go back with tangible results, they are killed. They are the weakest people from a tribe usually, and they are forcibly involved in, let's say, wrongdoings or criminal activities, and they are really at risk. So when you negotiate with pirates, you learn that the stakes are high, and among the stakes there are their own lives. To me, was strange, was counterintuitive. I was not used to think nothing like that before having the chance to co-design this program. But more generally, I agree with all of you that were saying that negotiation is really happening many times in so many fields and during so many activities. And at least in my university background, I was mistakenly used to think that the negotiation was mainly something like a utilitaristic act, trying to weight and counterweight reasons, rational objectives. I understood that I'm still learning that negotiation is mainly handling human beings, being emotional and being aware about the emotions that are within the negotiation arena, has lots to do with listening.
Yeah, I have not had the opportunity to negotiate with pirates, and hopefully I never will. But and so I was thinking, wow, my life doesn't get into those high stakes situations. However, I have been in, or my colleagues in obstetrics have been in situations in which, they're high stakes in a different way. We've had situations where a woman who's pregnant really wants to have her baby at home. There may be risk-related issues that physicians might frown upon for them wanting to have their birth at home. So there may be a negotiation that starts off right in the first prenatal care visit around that issue. And it can come in other ways in which a woman has decided to go ahead and have her baby at home, and then is her labor isn't going anywhere. And so they're in a situation where they have to come into the hospital and confront people with whom they may have never met before, because they never got their prenatal care or had their registration finalized with the hospital. So no one's really expecting them. And there's a negotiation right off the bat with what they'll accept, what they won't accept. And I think failing to listen and hear those concerns and understand their frames sets you up as a clinician to fail in constructing a collegial, respectful relationship in which a mother and baby can be safe.
Yeah, Rox, I think you made such a good point, and helping me think about everything that we collaborate with patients and their families. It's really a negotiation. I think, from my own schooling, I was taught that those things fall under what we call patient education. And we think that we can educate patients into compliance, or quote compliance. And I think this book really helped me look at it from a completely different lens. It is a negotiation, maybe to help patients to think about what medications they want to take or don't want to take differently, what interventions they want or don't want. It is a negotiation process, and I've had definitely situations where, from the point of view of clinicians, a cesarean section that needs to be urgently performed in order to save the lives of the mother and the infant. But sometimes mother doesn't want that, or the patient doesn't want that, or feels resistance for various reasons. And, and to me, that's a very high stakes situations that would require really high level negotiation skills. And it's not about educating people into submission. It's really, as Chris Voss mentioned in the book, it's really understanding what are the emotional drivers, what's important to that person. And also, I think one thing that stood out is, he really emphasized in one chapter that you really want to use that mirroring technique and listen and mirror back what that other person is saying until they say, that's right. You're understanding what I'm saying. And then also to get them not to say, well, you're right, I'll comply, but to get them to the point where they can say, that's fair.
As I was reading the book, I immediately thought of you when Chris Voss was talking about mirroring, because I didn't have a name for it, but I see you do that all the time when you serve as course director and you're leading conversations that we're having in the different modules, and you mirror so well, Grace. I just want to highlight how much you are doing that already, and to be able to label it and to understand it and the importance of it, I think for me was very illuminating.
Oh, thank you, Rox. Appreciate that.
I'm in the midst of this project of interviewing anesthesiologists and surgeons about their perceptions of each other. And I've read a lot of transcripts and coded a lot of transcripts recently of the perceptions they have of each other. And as I think about the idea of negotiating, this kind of book is what they all really need. And it's not just the book, because they won't get it from just reading the book, but getting the situations where you can get two people with such different, you'd think they all have the same goal. And if they talk about it, they sort of do, but they're coming from such different perceptions that there's a lot of negotiating going on of the kind that Leah was just talking about, but they're not even thinking it that way. I don't think they ever get metacognitive and think about, geez, how should I alter my approach to this? What's a different way of doing it? I think that's, some people actually talked about that they, in the interviews we did, that they actually do think that way, but I think that's the exception, not the rule. And a piece of it that I've gotten into lately is trying to understand how much do our stereotypes of the other people play into our ability to negotiate. This aspect of it is when you're talking to the other person, you have these perceptions, like Fernando just said, that before you learned about pirates, you probably had some perceptions of them. You had stereotypes, if you will, of the way they are. And if you hold those stereotypes, then it's blocking you from deeply listening and trying to understand what's a fair thing to do, what to really get something more like win-win. I mean, I'm more familiar, by the way, with the win-win, the Getting to Yes book, which was from the Harvard Negotiation Project. And it's not as much about these details of how you perceive the other person, how you talk to them, the mirroring. But I wonder how people think about, I think people who are familiar with the Getting to Yes negotiation strategies and what's different about what's in this book versus that.
Not so different, in my opinion.
Ah.
Getting to Yes, Fisher, Uri, the win-win approach, in my opinion, is quite similar. In Getting to Yes, you can find growing the pie, and growing the pie in order to explore and to find a commonly shared interest, perspective, and so on, in my opinion, is not so far from mirroring techniques, and mainly the mirroring philosophy, the philosophy behind the mirroring technique, that basically is do not reject, but reframe and explore to find agreements, points of convergence, something like that.
I read Getting to Yes so long ago,
Yeah.
but I feel like this book spoke to me from a more practical implementation perspective, and I think helped me reflect more upon drove it even more home to me, how my demeanor, my nonverbal communication patterns, and my tone of voice are so important, that and how they should align with the words that I speak, and vice versa, as I'm having a conversation with someone else, paying attention to all of that alignment. I just found so many more practical tips and a broadening of negotiation. I mean, it even made me think about and reflect on conversations I have with my husband. You know, there's little give and that and negotiation that happens throughout the day that you're not really labeling as such. But it made me reflect a little bit more about how I should be a better listener to him.
Yeah, actually, that's the same thing I jumped to, Roxane. Karma and I, some of you guys know my wife. Anyway, we were negotiating about going to my brother's house for Thanksgiving. And we were having a negotiation around that. We didn't realize it, but that's what it was. And we found a better solution. We weren't thinking, I mean, now as I'm listening to all this, I think I would have even been better if I'd been thinking, oh, this is a negotiation. And I was more deliberately trying to think about some of these things we're talking about and saying, oh, yeah, let me listen more deeply to what she's saying. Yeah. And, oh, yeah, I got to have more empathy because her point and how she feels.
Mhm.
I do know what she's talking about, but I want to get more empathic with where she's coming from. And yeah, I think being more deliberate about the idea of recognizing when discussions like that are really negotiations. It's just, I don't feel that word applies, but it really does.
Mhm.
And if I had been more deliberate about it, I could have, I think we got to a great place. I think we got to someplace better for both of us, not necessarily for my brother, but not everybody. You can't get win necessarily. You can go as close as you can, but it's friendly. There's no animosity. You know, it could have been a very contentious, hot issue, but it really, I think it came out well because I must have been practicing some of these things, but it could have been easier actually for me if I would have recognized what was going on and been more deliberate about it.
I think too, Jeff, and hearing that story, that was such a great example because it makes me think about the outcome and how we're perceiving the outcome to be. And the outcome does not have to be and probably shouldn't be, I'm negotiating to get to a point of this is what I want or a party wants. But what makes the most sense for all involved? There was a really practical example in the book. I think it was around a shoe, something like a wife was negotiating with a husband over brown shoes or black shoes. And if they compromised, he would be left with one brown and one black. And that outcome is just poor for everyone. So what is it that we're considering the acceptable outcome?
Well, I would have said maybe that's not so bad.
Maybe that's
That
not
if
so.
you actually went with each one, I just thought about it. I thought that'd be kind of fun to wear one of each shoe, because these days it's almost like a sign of your flexibility and that you're kind of a little more out there, and well, depending on where you live or who you hang out with, I suppose. But it might not actually been such a bad outcome.
Yeah, like there are people I know who make it a point of wearing two different socks. Like to me, that's like
People,
horrifying. Like
that's
I like to
right.
be symmetrical, but
That's right. That's what I was probably thinking of, because people more and more when I go to the gym, they're wearing two different socks. It's like, oh, well, that's really cool. Why am I wearing the same socks?
exactly.
So yeah, you can change the dynamic. It's not necessarily a bad outcome.
Well, I think we're winding down to the end of our time together on this topic of negotiating as if your life depended on it. And thanks to Chris Voss for bringing us together and helping us understand about never splitting the difference. So I'd like to thank all of my colleagues, Jeff Cooper, who was our executive director emeritus of the Center for Medical Simulation, spending time with us, for Fernando taking time out of his day in Italy and spending time sharing his experiences, and Grace and Leah, and totally appreciate all of your perspectives and sharing of your experiences and how this landed on you. So I wish everyone a great day today, and thank you, and look forward to seeing you at our next book club.